So welcome everybody to the fourth talk in the American Complicity series. We're very, very excited to have you today. So thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you viewing the recording, thank you so much for taking the time. We're really excited to have everyone, and we're really grateful to be able to put on this series. So as mentioned, this is actually the fourth talk that Combatants for Peace and Churches for Middle East Peace have collaborated on, focusing on American complicity in the Israeli occupation. And we have all of those recordings online, which we can send all four talks as well. We're very grateful to have two incredible speakers today. Matt Duss is our main speaker, the legendary advisor to Bernie Sanders, and today he is serving as he's a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and from 2017 to 2022, as you may know, he was foreign policy advisor to Bernie. And he was also foreign policy director to the Sanders 2020 campaign. Moderating today's talk is American Friends of Combatants for Peace board chair, Gilly Getz. Gilly is an Israeli-American photojournalist, activist, and peace activist, actor and peace activist, and his work is focused a lot on political activism in the States, and he's published across both Jewish and Israeli press. So we're very grateful to have both of them. Very briefly, I forgot to tell you about the two organizations, so let me do that quickly. As many of you know, Combatants for Peace, we're a grassroots movement of Palestinians and Israelis working together to end the occupation. American Friends of Combatants for Peace, we're their fiscal sponsor, and we are also sponsoring this talk today. And Churches for Middle East Peace, the other partner on this talk, works to encourage U.S. policies that actively promote a comprehensive resolution to the conflict. And so we're just all of us from both AFCFP and CMAP, we're all very grateful to have both you, Matt, and you, Gilly, here with us today. Very quickly, I apologize for all the logistics. If you have a question for our speaker, please check your chat box and put the question into send questions here. Those questions will be sent then to Gilly, who can ask them to Matt. And as a final note, I just want to say, and I'm sure our speakers will talk about this, but you've probably seen the Israeli election results, the devastating Israeli election results that came in last night and this morning. And all I can say is now more than ever, we need your support. Both with sponsoring organizations, like we have an uphill battle considering the government that just got put in. And anything you can do to support either Combatants for Peace or Churches for Middle East Peace. The peace movement needs you now more than ever. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This is our final talk in the American Complicity in Israeli occupation. And I really like to thank Churches for Middle East Peace and partnering with Combatants for Peace. So please check out the whole series. We look at different components of the complicity from American institutions to the evangelical community. We are a week out from the most consequential midterms of our lifetime, where the control of the House and Senate will be decided. And we are so lucky to have one of the smartest people I know in American foreign policy to help us understand how the outcome of the midterm elections might impact U.S. foreign policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine. I'd like to give a short framing for our conversation today. Both Congress and the administration often play a key role in upholding the occupation and preventing any meaningful consequences or accountability for the actions of the Israeli government against the Palestinian people, in efforts that are making the resolution to the conflict much harder with the ongoing expansion of settlements and de facto annexation. Even in the face of what we saw this year, just to name a few, what looks like the deadliest year for Palestinians on occupation since 2005, alarming increase in home demolitions and evictions, including East Jerusalem's, plans for mass expulsion looming in the Masafariata villages in the South Hebron Hills, dramatic rise in Jewish settler violence enabled and often joined by the IDF, criminalizing Palestinian human rights organization without any evidence, or even the killing of American citizens like the renowned journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. I want to start, Matt, if that's okay. First, as we talked before, your thoughts about the Israeli elections we just experienced yesterday. Bibi will be the next prime minister, and huge gains for both the fascist, supremacist, religious Zionist party and the ultra-Orthodox. The Democratic Change anti-Bibi bloc was decisively defeated. Of course, it's important to remember that millions of Palestinians who live under occupation cannot vote in these elections. Before the election, it was widely reported that Senator Robert Menendez, who chairs the Senate Committee for Foreign Relations and is one of the most hawkish Democrats, supported by AIPAC, of course, he told Netanyahu that if Ben Gvir, the big winner of the election yesterday, ahead of Jewish Power Party, is included in the coalition, quote, it could seriously erode bipartisan support in Washington. The Biden administration currently is trying to formulate their reaction. Can you, Matt, give us a sense of this moment, how you see it? What are the options of the administration, and what do you think will happen as we go forward?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for inviting me on. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, Gilly. I'm an admirer of yours as well, especially as someone who connects activism to art. As a musician myself, I just want to say how much I appreciate your work, and also to see Met the Combatants for Peace, both great organizations. So it's a real privilege. And Beth, thank you for that introduction. I will endeavor to live up to it. Just to back up, the administration's approach up until now has been essentially hands-off the occupation, and that pains me to say, because I as someone who's worked on these issues for a long time and spent 5.5 years working with Senator Sanders, someone who I think has really helped shift the debate on these issues in American politics, because he has taken, frankly, what I would just call a consistent position on human rights, noting that support for human rights also includes Palestinians. It includes Jews and Palestinians in the land of Israel, Palestine. That should not be a bold statement. Unfortunately, in the context of American politics, it is. I think we've seen, a shift, a continuing shift, but an impressive shift in the way these issues are discussed in this country, particularly in Congress. Unfortunately, the Biden administration does not seem to share that shift, at least at the highest level. And there's a few reasons for that. We can get into that, but let's just say that the facts of their policy have been that they are just not going to push the Israelis too hard. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is, as I remarked earlier today on Twitter, was concern that pushing too hard on Palestinian rights could potentially create problems within, Lapid's coalition and bring Bibi back. Well, that theory of the case seems no longer operative, because they didn't push hard at all on these issues, and they got Bibi back anyway. So I think this is a moment for all of us who believe that the United States should play a much more positive and constructive role with regard to ending the occupation and creating a situation where the people in Israel and Palestine can live with equality and real coexistence, to push the Biden administration to make good on your statements about values like democracy and human rights. There are a number, I would say Israel-Palestine is an issue where there is just such an enormous discrepancy between their rhetoric and the reality of the policy. So I think, clearly they were, not exactly surprised by this outcome, but it is one of the worst possible versions of the outcome I think a lot of people saw it coming. So they're right now in the process of formulating, okay, what is the best approach here? And of course, there's always going to be voices who advise, what they will call like political pragmatism, which is to be like, well, we can't solve the conflict, so we're just going to try and put this to the side. And I think that's a kind of very cynical and yet politically attractive approach. But my argument would be, if you want the United States to play a role in the world that supports human rights and that supports international law and supports international norms around the protection of civilians, I think something all of us want, and frankly, something that at least rhetorically the Biden administration claims to want. I think the next few days and weeks as they formulate their new approach, and certainly after America, the United States' own midterms, as we consider what that's going to look like, is a moment to really raise some of these issues and say, let's bring some consistency to U.S. foreign policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine.
Thank you so much, Matt. There's definitely an opportunity here for the administration to make a stand without the fear of helping getting re-elect Bibi. So I encourage everybody to send questions to the send question feature and ask Matt any questions, and I'll pass it by. So Matt, if we get a sense from you about, before we go into what's going to happen after the midterms, Republicans are poised to take the House, that obviously will change things. How is how is the foreign policy forming in the establishment in DC? We saw the Democratic primaries this year, where we have this disparity between. We see more and more people support Palestinian rights in the Democratic Party, including young people. There is a dramatic shift, yet the politics often doesn't reflect that. And we saw in the primary an incredible effort by AIPAC and DMFI that spent unprecedented amount of money, really unprecedented, only in the Democratic primary to tackle any progressive that might speak critically about Palestinian rights, about the occupation. What type of silencing effect that has at the end of formulating foreign policy positions, and kind of how that dynamic affects the end product?
Yeah, you're right. I think that that was a phenomenon that we really have seen this cycle that is very notable. And I'll say two things about it. First of all, we just have to recognize that the threat, and it is a threat. It is designed as a threat to anyone who takes even the slightest position in favor of Palestinian rights. For example, Summer Lee, who won her primary despite millions upon millions of dollars being plowed into that race by AIPAC and DMFI against her. I mean, her position, I think she basically had one tweet in favor of Palestinian rights. But simply by virtue of being a Black woman who was, standing kind of together with the squad, so-called, on a number of other issues. This just needs to be understood as a kind of an anti-progressive campaign. And unfortunately, given the way that our American political system works, our elections, which I'm just going to say it straightforwardly, is extremely corrupt and dominated by money. That is an effective way for big donors and organizations like AIPAC and DMFI to kind of create a chilling effect against, or at least send a warning, like unless you want to face this kind of spending against your next race, against you in your next race, you'll just stay away from this issue. But I would also say this in itself is a reaction to the considerable success, I think, that progressives have had in shifting the debate, particularly the Palestinian American community, but not only the Palestinian American community. I think a lot of credit goes to Jewish progressive colleagues who have pushed these issues, like our friends, the people we know and love, if not now, J Street, a number of other groups who've worked not only on this issue but have connected the issue of ending the occupation to a kind of broader progressive agenda. And AIPAC sees the shift that is going on in the Democratic Party, and quite rightly sees that as a threat to their political agenda, which is no questions about Israel, never criticize, it's just support Israel, shut up, and that's it. So I mean, there's a saying, it's kind of apocryphally attributed to Gandhi, It goes, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. We are very much into the then they fight you part of that saying. So it's going to get tougher before it gets easier. But this is part of the process of shifting the debate.
And it's important to point out that when AIPAC runs ads in these races, it never mentions Israel. It's not like it's a popular issue.
Right. I think that is really important to point out too. Thank you for bringing that up, because that is kind of, it has been very clarifying how AIPAC itself understands what is necessary to kind of maintain what they call, a pro-Israel majority in Congress. That is, spend tens of millions of dollars in primaries and don't mention Israel. So this is not an organization that seems particularly confident in its own policy arguments, and they are right not to be.
And after they win these races, or the candidate they supported win these races, obviously they tout Israel as the reason, even though it's never mentioned in the actual campaigns.
Exactly. And in the cases when they lose, it's like, well, of course, this was not an issue. So it's heads they win, tails, you lose.
So, Matt, we have some great questions. Before we get to them, if you can tell us, how does the American foreign policy upholds the occupation? In what sense? And what are the tools that, let's say, we do get good leadership and the political incentive to act? What type of tools does the American administration has? The Leahy law, or what type of kind of accountability? If the political will is there, can the administration asked or put into play?
Right. I think political will is really the kind of key question. I mean, another way I would put it is just basic political courage. The United States gives an enormous amount of military aid to Israel, $3.8 billion a year. Israel is by far the single biggest recipient of U.S. aid over the past several decades. So, I mean, there are laws on the books. You mentioned the Leahy law, but other more basic laws with regard to U.S. military aid that govern, the end use of U.S. supplied weapons. Are they being used in a way that violates human rights standards? The question is, does any administration have actually the political courage to enforce the law as written? And we see, time after time, year after year, administration after administration. Unfortunately, when it comes to Israel, the answer is no. And I think, part of changing that is building up support for members of Congress, electing members of Congress who themselves have the courage to raise these issues. Certainly, Senator Leahy has been one of those. Unfortunately, his time in Congress is coming to an end. But even he put out a statement a few weeks ago about Shireen Abu Akleh that I think it was so strong, it even kind of shocked me, where he referenced the laws that bear his name, saying that these should apply. And of course, the answer is yes, they should apply. I mean, no one really raises an eyebrow when the administration decides, well, okay, we're going to withhold some aid from Egypt because they are, engaged in this massive crackdown. I would wish the administration would withhold all of that aid, so as not to assist the Egyptian regime in their crackdown. But the same principles should apply when it comes to Israel's management of the occupation and some of the abuses that we constantly see reported by not only international human rights organizations, but Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations. I mean, I would just add to this to say, this is not to say that the United States' relationship with Israel should or will become a hostile one. This is just kind of a normal part of any normal relationship, even with partners, is to say, like, listen, this is American taxpayer money. The American people, through members of Congress, have passed laws that govern how this money may be spent and the uses to which these weapons may be put. And if you are violating these laws, then we're going to need to restrict or limit or even cancel this aid. So I think, again, it just comes down to bringing a consistency to the way we manage these relations.
Thank you so much for that. I unmuted myself. So we have a few questions about the intersection between American democracy and this type of policy upholding the occupation? Do you see a link between them, and do you see between them and Palestinian liberation? That's I guess just I'll leave you with that question.
Sure. I mean, well, I think, the U.S. has played a role over years and decades in not only, supporting Israel militarily, but also protecting Israel from kind of diplomatic consequences and political consequences for the occupation. I think people remember the UN Security Council resolution that passed at the end of Obama's term. The United States abstained from vetoing that. And that was notable only because that was just so out of character. The United States usually blocks those, and in fact did block a very similar resolution just a few years before that, and should not have done so. I mean, because, if we are going to claim to support international law, claim to support UN resolutions, then we should be willing to follow through when our partners, even our closest partners, like Israel, violate those norms and resolutions. So I think that's one way in which the U.S. has been, implicated in supporting the occupation. But I would also, it's important to understand some other background here too. I mean, we're coming out of a 20-year period, of the so-called global war on terror. And I think this was, for understandable reasons, America saw, buses and restaurants blowing up in Israel, the Second Intifada. This was extremely ugly. It was a terrible time. I don't need to tell probably many of our viewers how terrible it was, but understanding the impact that made on Israel, and certainly on supporters of Israel in the United States, that is an extremely politically, explosive, to use probably the wrong word, but that really gave a lot of Americans a sense of kind of commonality in the wake of 9/11 with what Americans had faced and what many Americans feared. Now, I think, you have leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu who very, very skillfully, I think, exploited those shared concerns. No one disagrees that terrorism is awful and should be fought, and we need to use, whatever tools we can to prevent it. But I also think it's important to understand that, characterizing Palestinians simply as terrorists is not only false and offensive, but has helped to sustain this policy of, dispossession and repression that continues to today.
Thank you so much. We do have a question about if you can explain more about the Leahy law, and if you can explain more about the way to enforce regulations on weapon use. I know it gets into the nitty-gritty, but
sure. I mean, without getting too nerdy, I mean, the Leahy law is, has to do with reporting that's required by the State Department, or from the State Department, relating to training and weapons that are provided to different military units in other countries. Like if military units in other countries are credibly accused of very serious and ongoing human rights violations, that needs to be reported back up through the State Department, and would then require that aid to be suspended. That's basically what it is. I mean, that is one of the most kind of restrictive approaches to human rights violations. But again, we come down to the question of, is there the political will to actually do this reporting, and then once the reporting is actually done, to act upon it? And so there are any number of points along the way where if the right person isn't ready to make the right moves, it simply won't happen.
Thank you. So we have a few questions about, in case Republicans do get control of Congress, how would that change the status quo, so to speak, in terms of the possibilities of a two-state solution, in terms of the ability to boycott? And is there fear that Democrats will play some role in criminalizing boycotts and I guess the worst case scenario?
Well, I think Republicans have already promised that they're going to be launching all kinds of investigations into the Biden administration up to and possibly including some impeachment investigations. I mean, the way that party is moving is troubling in so many ways. And clearly one of those ways in which, this increasingly openly racist party has just become much more fanatically pro-Israel. So I think, there will, almost certainly be pressure on the Biden administration to not only put no pressure on the Israelis around the occupation or the issue of Palestinian rights, but to actually put more pressure on the Palestinians themselves, on the Palestinian leadership, lots of new sanctions and restrictions on any US aid that might go to help the Palestinians. To limit that aid even more. We all probably know about the Taylor Force Act. But there were different ways that the Biden administration, I mean, one of the few areas where they did do some good on the Palestinian issue is, restarting UNRWA funding, other things like that. So I think there'll probably be efforts, to try and limit that. And we'll have to see whether the administration, given all the other fires they'll be trying to put out from this Congress, will have the energy and the time and the courage to actually hold that, either veto that or respond to that or fight those efforts, and whether Democrats in Congress will be able to help them in that.
Thank you. We have a question about the relationship of the administration in the United States with the ICC, and as an avenue for Palestinians to ask the international community if we get to the mass expulsion of Masafriata, 1,000 Palestinians. B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, did support the going to the International Criminal Court. Can you describe the relationship and the kind of the policy around it, how rigid it is? And
yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it seems to be fairly rigid. I mean, they've decided that, I think back to a hearing. This was probably over a year ago, and where I think Congresswoman Ilhan Omar got some criticism for comparing things the U.S. and Israel had done to things that the Taliban had done. And frankly, I think her question was an entirely reasonable one, because it was, we've committed atrocities, the Taliban has. This is not to equate the United States and the Taliban. It is simply to point out that we have committed some of these, very serious offenses. Why should we hold ourselves and our partners above accountability on the question of the ICC, while declaring that the ICC is an appropriate venue for others? And the response that came was that, well, the U.S. and Israel have mechanisms of accountability that make the ICC kind of an appropriate venue. And I thought that was just staggering. Because as we, my question is like, what mechanisms are you talking about? In both cases of the United States and Israel, we see examples, for example, like last summer, that drone strike that killed a man and I think about 7 of his kids in Afghanistan. Turned out it was a total mistake. They thought he was a member of the Taliban, and that the intelligence was wrong. 10 civilians were killed. No one was punished. No one was held accountable. No one was disciplined in any way whatsoever. That is not accountability. That is something we also see with regard to Israel. No one, I mean, the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. No one has been held accountable or disciplined in any way. So I think part of it is just being able to, find ways to raise these issues, to bring political pressure, and push the administration to make good on their rhetoric, because right now they are simply not doing it. And I know that sounds kind of abstract, but I'll just say that, one of the things I do hear from colleagues inside the administration is that, oftentimes they do know that there is a massive kind of contradiction in their rhetoric and the actual policy. But when they're being honest, they'll say, the pressure we're getting is coming all from the right. We hear relatively little from the progressive side when they're, when they're raising alarms or pressing us from Congress around these issues. So I do think finding ways to work through Congress and in the public to push harder. And I think, on just staying on the issue of Shireen, I do think that we've seen a pretty impressive effort on the part of a number of members of Congress and Senate, particularly Senator Chris Van Hollen, who have led in pushing for a real investigation and real accountability around the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. But at the same time, they shouldn't have to work this hard to push the United States administration to investigate the killing of a United States citizen. So that itself is kind of a sad commentary on where this administration is.
Thank you. We have a question about reaching out to Republicans. Is there anything, people with Republican members of Congress, do you have any advice on that? Is there any there when it comes to the Republican Party?
I mean, unfortunately, I think the Republican Party, as I said, has moved into a much more, I would say, fanatically pro-Israel position. But there is always a good reason for people to reach out to their members of Congress and their senator, because all of these offices track very closely the amount of outreach they get on any particular issue, particularly when it's coming from their state or their district. So, even one phone call is a data point on the side of good, even for a member of Congress who is not inclined to do any good on this issue. So I would say absolutely, it may seem like one drop in the bucket, but lots of drops fill the bucket. So keep it up.
Thank you for that. I mean, it was extraordinary, when I did advocacy with J Street, it was extraordinary to see members of Congress, even senior senators, talking about how they can't really feel free to express how they feel because of political pressure, because they don't feel they have the backing. It's always extraordinary for me to hear how much hearing from your constituency is important, to give them
Absolutely.
the courage to speak out. So we have a few questions about the administration posture on two-state solution. So as the opportunity shrinks for a two-state solution, what should that be? And if you can have some thoughts about the Abraham Accords, and I know the administration is very supportive of expanding the accords, possibly to include Saudi Arabia. A little bit of your thoughts about that, if in the current political climate.
Yeah, repeat that last question.
So the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
Your thoughts about the accords. On the one hand, they're great. They're great expanding peace. On the other hand, they're normalizing.
Right.
And include mass weapon deals.
Yes. No, I think that's a really good question. And it's a tough one, right? Because, I mean, on the face of it, normalization is wonderful. I certainly want to see a Middle East where Israel is accepted and a part of the Middle East, because Israel and Israelis, Jews and Palestinians are part of the Middle East. And I think we should be able to say that unequivocally. At the same time, this agreement is not about peace. As you said, this is an agreement not between peoples, but between governments and regimes. Between some regimes that are engaged in some very, very heavy repression. So unfortunately, rather than kind of, as I see it, and it's not just my analysis, when I talk to people in the region, Israelis, Palestinians, and people from other Arab states, this is leading to a future that essentially accepts this repression as the normal state of affairs into the future. And I think, I simply don't agree with that. But unfortunately, the Biden administration has decided that their approach is, well, the Abraham Accords are there. We're going to try to use it to produce, some good outcomes. And, I guess that's a decent theory, except that it overlooks the fact that this, agreement was designed to produce a very different outcome, a very bad outcome. It was used, first of all, in the immediate term, it was a way, it provided an excuse for Netanyahu not to move forward with annexation. de jure annexation. De facto annexation, as everyone probably knows, goes forward every single day. It provided a way for UAE to play a positive role and to kind of begin to repair its own reputation in Washington after the disastrous Yemen war, which is still ongoing. So again, I think we have to, find ways to make what is frankly a bit of a complicated and nuanced argument about why this agreement is not promoting the goals that it was sold as promoting. If that should change, I would be very, very happy. If there was a way to actually bring in the Palestinians, if there was a way to deploy, or at least exploit the Abraham Accords as a way to get toward a situation of real equality, that would be great. But again, that overlooks the fact that this agreement was designed as a way to completely sidestep that issue and not deal with it.
Yeah, there was a current line in the Israeli left that the only way to make peace with Arab countries were to first resolve the Palestinian Israeli conflict, and that's obviously no longer true. I think Bibi won that point, and now we're in the process of normalization. So there's a question here about the visa waiver program that the administration has not decided on yet. If you could break it down regarding the a way to pressure Israel. Obviously, there's concerns about discriminatory policies, which is why the program is not approved yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, the program's not approved yet because Israel straightforwardly violates its standards. In order to be able to join the visa waiver program, you have to be able to demonstrate that you do not discriminate against American citizens. And as we all know, Israel does discriminate very harshly against American citizens of Palestinian and Arab ethnicity. And that is simply a non-starter. So again, I think they will, a new Republican Congress will probably try to put pressure on this. But I know that, a number of Democratic offices have made this a real, they've really, pushed very hard on this issue. And I would hope, and I think I expect that the administration will stand firm on this, because there is just no plausible argument that Israel actually meets the requirements for this program.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions. Thank you for everybody for your great questions. So we have a lot of questions about AIPAC, about Democrats speaking at the AIPAC conference, the fact that AIPAC is endorsing 109 members of Congress who participated in the coup and voted against the certification of the election. What should Democrats' relationship to AIPAC be? That's kind of the gist of the questions. If you give us a sense of your thoughts on that, kind of knowing Washington.
Yeah, I mean, it was bad enough when AIPAC was plowing money into Democratic primaries to beat progressives, but as we see in the case of Summer Lee in Pittsburgh, they are now getting engaged in the general in support of a Republican to defeat a Democrat. This is very, very new territory. So, I mean, it's hard to see how Democrats could continue to engage in the same level with AIPAC if this organization is now explicitly working against maintaining a Democratic congressional majority. I have little doubt that they will come up with a good excuse for why they should. But again, I think it's on the rest of us to raise these issues and make it very uncomfortable for them. Because unfortunately, I mean, listen, I have, engaged with AIPAC throughout my career. Happy to meet with anyone who wants to meet and talk in a good faith way about the issues. When I was a member of Senator Sanders' staff, I was always very happy to meet with Vermonters who are members of AIPAC because they are constituents. This isn't, an organization that has a lot of members, but I do think, it's important for us to understand that they had made a different strategic choice now about how best to advance their agenda. And I think they've made a set of choices that should make it very problematic for Democrats to continue to relate to them in the same way.
Thank you for that. We have another question about the relationship with Saudi Arabia. And the connection to Israel Palestine. Will change in attitudes towards Saudi Arabia make any difference in the United States foreign policy towards Israel Palestine if they get closer together? And I got to say that Senator Sanders was incredible in speaking against Saudi Arabia before it was popular, so to speak, back in the day. So
yeah, he's pretty good at doing that on a bunch of issues. But yeah,
yes, the talent. So if you can talk a little bit to that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think, yes, Americans in general have had questions about this for a long time, about this, this regime that is undemocratic, that is a monarchy, that is in its way deeply corrupt and repressive. What is the United States, is it really appropriate for the United States to have so close a relationship with a government like this? Now, obviously, the oil and energy issue comes into play. Saudi Arabia, as everyone knows, has enormous energy reserves. There's a lot of oil there. That's one consideration, but it should, not be the overriding consideration. And we saw President Biden make a trip to Saudi Arabia and Israel this past summer, in a trip that was very controversial, and rightly so, because as a candidate, he had voiced some really severe criticisms, very justifiable criticisms of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman around a range of issues, but particularly the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The administration released or made public an intelligence assessment early on that that stated the intelligence community's view, the U.S. intelligence community's view, that Mohammed bin Salman was responsible for this murder, and yet just over a year later, he decided that it was necessary to go and appear with Mohammed bin Salman. They did their fist bump. They had a summit. And even as distasteful as I found that, my question to the administration and publicly was, what are we getting out of it? Well, a few months later, it found that what we got out of it was that the Saudis decided to cut oil production and potentially cause, an economic downturn, certainly higher gas prices at some point soon. It's hard to say how these, there's often not an immediately direct correlation, but still, the fact is the United States was urging the Saudis not to do this, and they went ahead and did it anyway, even despite the president's very, very clear attempt to put the relationship on a better footing. So I think, they've said they're in a period of reassessment of the relationship. When someone says we are reassessing, that often means like we're just going to try to kind of look busy until we can get back to business. I hope that is not the case. And again, this is something where I think it's very important for people to continue to press this issue and make clear that we can't go back to business as usual with the Saudi government, particularly under the leadership of someone like Mohammed bin Salman, who has shown himself to be, let's just say the best way to put it is a reckless leader.
Thank you for that. So we have a series of questions about the two-state solution, about the feasibility of it. What should the foreign policy be when it comes to a two-state solution with their support for confederation? I'm following kind of the Israeli left on Twitter right now, being, shell-shocked, but also realizing something has to change. Some things just don't work, and Jewish-Arab partnership has to be key cornerstone on that. But rethinking how they speak about equality, which is really interesting. But that's just some of your thoughts about. I know it's a very difficult issue. I think two-state solution is. I like the confederation. I think two-state solution is some sort of a model to build on. But what's your thought? The foreign policy should be on,
right. I think the two-state solution has, I think there are things about it that were and are very attractive. Two states for two peoples, each, the Palestinian people and the Jewish people having states as a way to kind of actually, actualize their self-determination and build their own cultures and share the land. But for reasons I think everyone understands, the increase of settlements, the kind of isolation, increased isolation of Palestinians into kind of enclaves. I think calling them Bantustans is entirely justified because it seems like that is the actual policy on the ground. So as I look at the map, getting to an actual situation of a viable Palestinian state is going to be very, very difficult. But having said that, I also think that doesn't need to be the immediate kind of priority. Because I think debates about, okay, what do you think the end state should actually be, are so often used to prevent us from actually talking about what the reality is on the ground right now. And that's where I think the focus should be, is that we are in a reality of occupation. Some would use the word apartheid, but whatever word one uses, I think we can all agree that we are in a system of massive systemic discrimination and inequality. And as a progressive, that is something that is not acceptable to me. And it's something that I know that is unacceptable to my Israeli progressive colleagues and my Palestinian colleagues, certainly, who have to live under that situation. So, as an American, the way I approach this is to say, yes, I can imagine a number of possible scenarios and end states that enable the self-determination of both people. But what I would like to see is the United States actually enforcing its own laws with regard to these human rights violations. And in my view, part of the reason we are stuck in this situation is because there are zero costs for occupation right now. The United States has protected Israel from any consequences from what are in fact extremely egregious human rights abuses. If some of those costs began to be experienced, I think it's very possible that the conversation within Israel might begin to shift in a way that cause people to say, all right, let's look at some other ways to do this policy. It may not. It may increase nationalism. It may increase hostility. I don't want that to happen. But I also want my country to enforce its laws and enforce its make good on its own rhetoric when it comes to human rights. For me, that is the priority.
And going forward, what should be we started this series talking a little bit about building coalitions across differences in order to confront this rising in authoritarianism, rising in intolerance, anti-democratic forces that rise both in Israel and in America and all over the world. What should the progressive position be going forward? Confronting, we have some questions about confronting AIPAC, about building solidarity. Combats for Peace is a binational movement. We often deal with different points of view, but we have like you said, a commitment to equality, a commitment to freedom, to democracy. What should the progressive position be, trying to negotiate the tensions between Zionism, anti-Zionism, all the things that exist in a progressive political spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be, there's nothing wrong with, wanting a state for the Jews. There's nothing wrong with wanting to enable the Jewish people to have a place where they can, first of all, have security, but also to express their national identity and to build their national culture. The question is that coming at the expense of other people who live there? I think the same applies to the United States, certainly. At the end of the day, I would put questions of kind of ethnic nationalism aside and say, I mean, as I see it, the thing that progressives share, whether Israeli progressives, American progressives, or whomever, is, do we believe in equality, political equality, creating a system that diminishes economic inequality, which, as we see, like economic inequality leads to political, or empowers and exacerbates political inequality. I think that's one of the truths of this kind of global movement that we've seen. You mentioned the rise of authoritarianism, and Senator Sanders has written and spoken about this a lot, is like, we need to understand the connections between this rising global authoritarian movement and its connections between oligarchy and corruption, and the way these things work together in overlapping ways in various countries, and exploit the weaknesses in democratic systems. And that exists in Israel, that exists in the United States. So I think there are issues here that are bigger than Israel Palestine, but they are issues that I think Israelis and Palestinians and Americans and colleagues around the world, whether in the Philippines, whether in France, whether in Russia, whether in Ukraine, can and should find ways to address in a more united way. I mean, I'll come back to this word I often that I think matters a lot to progressives, and that's solidarity. What is the best way to show solidarity for those who are working for a more equal and just society in Israel Palestine? What is the best way? What are the best policies we can support to show solidarity with Ukrainians trying to defend themselves? What are the ways we can show solidarity with people in the Philippines who are working against a government that is really repressive in its own way? And I don't pretend it's simple, but I think understanding that one of the most important ways we can address the problems in our individual countries is to try to develop a stronger theory of the case on the challenges we all share.
Thank you. And the fact that supremacy will keep no one free or safe, and that's
right.
And that's ultimately the argument, that only if all of us will be equal and free, will be safe. Supremacy will keep no one safe,
right?
Either in the United States or in Israel Palestine, right, or any else other place in the world. So we're reaching close to our end before we make our final pitch. Is there any last words you want to say as we head into these really important midterms that seem like a nail biter? I mean, the House will take a miracle to win, of course, but in the Senate, it seems like a nail biter. Even here in New York, where I'm at, the governor's race is inching closer to being close. Do you have any last thoughts about the political moment we're facing here in America?
Well, I would say just in this last few days before the election, there is still time to reach out to local candidates, even candidates around the country, to volunteer for phone banking, for those who are able to do kind of knocking on doors and everything like that, or even just contribute. There's still a role to play, in these elections. But broadly, whatever happens next Tuesday, as I often say, just the work continues. I mean, we're here because people who came before us confronted moments like this and far worse moments, and came through it. So I just, all I can say is, I mean, the struggle is hard, but you keep the work, you just keep on working. So I guess that's as best I can put it.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for everyone. And I'd like to, finally make a pitch. We trying to build a grassroots movement in Israel Palestine that is all about equality, about a joint struggle, about joint resistance. And we really can't do it without your help. And this moment is especially important for people on the ground who model a better world, a better reality together in the face of really difficult reality that is about to get much difficult. And also a pitch for Churches for Middle East Peace, of organizing churches for peace and equality in Israel, Palestine, and obviously a multi-faith coalition, all invested in bringing peace and equality to the region. So in the chat, you'll have a bunch of chances to donate to both of the organizations. Please follow the work. It's modeling extraordinary activism on the ground. And don't forget to check out the joint memorial ceremony, joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial ceremony in combination with bereaved family forum, and also the joint Nakba Day that we host. These are two big events, and you will, if you haven't attended, you'll see something you've never seen before. These are the biggest peace events on the most sacred dates in the Israeli and Palestinian calendar of mourning, and we mourn together, and we act together, and we resist together, and that is a truly unique and extraordinary. And we hope you help us in helping with that effort. There's somebody mentioned about your music and your musician, so I just wanted to throw it out there. And he wrote to you, great. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Matt. Please check out the rest of the series that explores other aspects of complicity in the Israeli occupations. And yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. And we hope to see you again in future events. Keep looking for our emails. Thank you so much.
Thank you.